Part 2, Chapter 10. The Divine Function of Imagination in the Cure of Disease. The faculty of imagination, in the estimate of the popular mind, and even among those who pass current in the world for scientific men, has been greatly undervalued. It has been degraded to a lower level among our intellectual powers than by divine right belongs to it. It is really one of the highest and most influential powers of the soul. We have been educated to believe that an imaginary disease, or one that owes its origin and continuance to an abnormal action of this mental power upon the body, is an unreal one. It is supposed to be the magnifying into undue proportions of what has no importance, or the creation of something out of nothing. This is false in philosophy and untrue in fact. The imagination, or, as Fichte calls it, the fancy, is the formative power of the body. It has in it a creative potency. God created, and perpetually creates, the world by some power that answers to imagination in us. And how much of our life do we spend in a world of our own making? The creations of fiction are as real as those of history, and there is as much truth in the one as in the other. Fiction, in the etymological sense of the word, is that which the mind makes. Poetry, from a Greek word of a similar meaning, has the same signification. They are mental creations. The imagination is the image-making faculty, or that which forms an idea that it can so project outward as to view it outside of the being of the mind. It creates the world in which we really live, and the body by which the soul enters into the limitations of time and space, and where we temporarily dwell. We wish to elevate this most important faculty from its degradation in mental science and the estimation of the world to its native divine dignity and importance. The imagination is a spiritual force and a creative power. An imaginary disease is not an unreal one, for we cannot fancy a thing that has no existence. What the populace say about imagination presenting images that we mistake for reality is, like popular philosophy in general, pure nonsense. No man ever imagined or can imagine anything that has not reality somewhere, and this whether waking or sleeping. The creations of the imagination are as real as our own bodies, or any of the objects that come to our perception through the senses. To cure a disease of mind or body by this power or force is not to heal a person of what never ailed him, or of what had no actual existence. The very fact that a man imagines himself sick is a proof that he is so, for the disease is only the effect of an abnormal action of this creative power. The imagination is both an involuntary and a voluntary power of the mind. In its involuntary and preconscious action, it builds up the organism, heals its wounds, reacts against every abnormal condition, and carries on all the physiological processes and so-called automatic movements. But the will or self-determining power of the soul, guided by an instinctive intelligence, may take all these processes under its control, and what is called the vital force, which can never be distinguished from the action of the mind upon the body, can be precipitated upon any given point of the organism for the modification of its condition and the production of a desired sanative result. Could we trace the mental history of every disease, we should see how much it was the product of this power. And if we could see the hidden influences that were at work in every case of cure, we should perceive how much was owing to the productive spiritual force of the imagination, combined with faith in effecting the therapeutic result. In these two spiritual forces, or agencies, we have the most important of all curative devices. They ought to be more profoundly studied, as they possess a higher sanative value than all that the materia medica has given us. Nowhere do we find their efficiency so fully illustrated as in the life and practice of Jesus the Christ. By him they have received the seal and sanction of the divine method of cure. From what has been said above we see why the irregular, or unauthorized, practitioner is so often successful where the learned ignorance of the regular physician has failed. The first somehow brings into action the divine principles of faith and imagination and directs their force upon the body, and the world accepts the result as almost if not quite miraculous. The time may come when there will be an entire revolution of public opinion, and the now unorthodox physician, who appeals, whether he knows it or not, more directly to the two principles that in the highest degree influence the bodily condition, will be accepted as the man who is legally authorized to prescribe for the ills that flesh is heir to. He who can best minister to a mind diseased, and control and direct these mental forces so as to modify the corporeal condition, is the best physician. And if he is constrained by the love of Christ, or the same benevolent impulse that actuated him, he is in the regular line of apostolic succession, even though no mitred priest has laid hands upon his head, and consecrated him to a work the importance of which the ecclesiastical functionary understands but little or even nothing. If what has been said above is true as to the real principle of cure, then the only rational design in prescribing material remedies is to furnish aids to faith and imagination, which are the efficient cause of that alteration of the bodily and mental condition that we call recovery from disease. If a patient's faith is so weak that it cannot walk alone, give him a drug to be a cane on which a saving and healing faith may lean for support, or prescribe for him some pharmaceutical preparation, homeopathic or allopathic, as a crutch, by the aid of which the imagination may hobble along in the direction of health and happiness. But blessed is the man who has passed the infantile state of his existence and been weaned of his dependence upon material things, and who can walk erect in the divine dignity of his spiritual nature as an image of God, and whoso faith brings him into living contact and conjunction with the central life. If it be true, as has been admitted by the intuitive reason of mankind, and has become an axiom of philosophy, that inertia is a property and necessary condition of matter, or in other words, that it can neither move nor effect any change in its state unless it be acted upon by some force outside of itself and distinct from it, then it follows that there are no automatic or self-originated movements or changes of the material organism. Every change in the bodily status in the direction of disease or health is an effect for which medical philosophy must find a call so that is not in the body itself, and I verily believe and, without hesitation, affirm that the only efficient cause is some action of mind. The body, in all its varying conditions and changes, is only an outward manifestation, a material and sensible expression of the state of the soul. This is under God, the creative power of the body. It speaks and it is done. The mental forces that originate and modify the condition of the body are faith and imagination. These may act preconsciously or voluntarily and with conscious effort. Thus, the whole science of medicine, through all the ages of its history and all its conflicting schools, may be condensed into a single sentence, in which they are all reduced to an essential unity. If you would cure disease, call into active operation the principles of faith and imagination. All curative devices that do not effect this are powerless. As Professor Croth has said in his annotations on Berkeley's Principles of Human Knowledge, no theory of the human body is worthy of attention which does not acknowledge the soul as the controlling force of the body. The psychical is first. The mind is the conditioning power of the material. It is the organizing force that lifts the organic out of the inorganic. In its relation to the body, the mind is a sort of vice-creator or secondary formative power, and this productive and constructive energy is something very like what we call imagination. I as firmly believe as I do in my own existence that there is here a principle of vast practical importance, and one that contains the seed of a valuable and efficient system of phrenopathy, or mental medicine. The things seen by the imagination are called phantoms, by which is meant unreal appearances. That they are so is an assumption not capable of proof. They may be as real as the objects of the external world. We have the same evidence of the reality of the one that we have of the other, as both are seen only in the mind. When I assert that heat is in the fire, it is a phantom or fallacious appearance, for the real truth is that it is a sensation in me. When one says that he has a pain in some part of his body, as in his hand, his head, or his stomach, that is a phantom, for the body has no sensation, no feeling. The pain is no more there than when it is felt in an amputated limb. But we can imagine a pain until we feel it, and we can imagine and fear a disease until, by the creative power of these mental forces, we really have it. So the same is true of health. By a voluntary and intelligent use of faith and imagination, we can effect a cure of disease in ourselves and others. I know of no writer who takes a higher view of the imagination as a creative force than Jacob Behmen, the Theosophist. Instead of looking upon it as an impotent faculty of the mind, dealing in fiction and airy nothings, he viewed it as the greatest power in nature. All outward power that we exercise over the things about us is but a shadow in comparison with that inward power that resides in imagination and will. It communicates with eternity and cooperates with the divine creative life, and nothing is impossible to it. It was considered by him as one of the chief instruments of conversion and regeneration, and its use was recommended as such, and he might just as well have said as much of its influence in the cure of diseases of the mind and the body had he traced its influence in that direction. Van Helmont declares that there is an inner power of the soul whence the mightiest events, the deepest impressions, and the most decisive effects proceed. He says, I have hitherto avoided revealing the great secret that the strength lies concealed in man merely through the suggestion and power of the imagination, to work outwardly, and to impress this strength on others, which then continues of itself, and operates on the remotest objects. Ennemoser, who had a clear perception of the influence of the mind upon the body, says of the power of the imagination that an intensely active imagination transforms the ideas of fancy into permanent shapes, which even obtain a certain plastic firmness in the body. The soul creates and the body forms, and in fact only to that shape which has been held before it. The imagination is the creative and inventive power of the soul, which endeavors to reproduce outwardly that which it inwardly believed. And this succeeds more especially when the body is in a passive condition and the outward senses are dormant. Imagination is an element in an act of saving or healing faith, as was recognized by Bayman. The person of an active or strong imagination is one whose faith is the substance of things hoped for. It gives life and reality to faith. Stewart, the Scotch metaphysician, came near expressing this truth. It was his opinion that the exercise of the imagination is always accompanied with a belief that the objects of the imagination exist. Professor Perrier remarks of this opinion of Stewart that it appears to him to be founded in truth. Imagination is the power by which the thoughts, the ideas of the mind, are projected outward into an actuality in the body. In connection with faith in God, the ever-present and ever-active creative force, the body is molded by it into the external expression of what the mind conceives and desires as a state of physical health. It is a power when properly educated and conjoined with faith that brings the soul, in its curative effort, into communicative contact with the immeasurable life, and thus feeds and augments our noblest powers from their eternal source. It is in us the image or finite expression of God's creative energy and, consequently, when used under the guidance of a spiritual intelligence, is the greatest healing power in nature. Imagination is only a mode of thought, and its power is only an illustration of the influence of thought. What passes in the church parlance under the name of conversion or a change of heart is affected by this transforming power. The doctrine of justification by faith, which is the central idea of the Pauline development of Christianity, and which, after having been buried out of sight by the ritualism and externalism of the Papal Church, was restored as a saving power to the Christian system by Luther, and which was again dropped out of the creed of the religious world until revived by the Wesleys, and then became a saving power to millions of souls, owes its efficiency to the imagination. The penitent comes into the idea or belief that he is condemned of God, and is burdened with the sense of guilt, which is called conviction. He is now willing and desirous to be saved, and is taught to believe, that is, to think or imagine that God now forgives and saves him. This is only a belief of the truth, as God forgives all and condemns none. And then his burden of self-imposed condemnation rolls off, his self-torment, doubt, and mental turmoil cease, and, coming to an inward sense of justification by faith or imagination, he enters into a solid and enduring peace. But imagination has much to do with this, as was taught by Bayman, and as anyone can see who can analyze the mental process involved in the change of the spiritual status of the convert. But I charge the reader to bear in mind that the change is none the less real by being affected mainly by the transforming power of the imagination. In a connection with the Church for more than 40 years, and by an unbiased study of the psychological phenomena of revivals, I know that the mental metamorphosis, called conversion, has often in it the element of permanency, and the soul by it becomes anchored in the divine life. Same remarks will apply to the cure of all diseases of the body and mind, which constituted the fullness of the idea of salvation as it existed in the mind of the Christ, and is expressed in the Gospels.